Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. The FTX Crypto Cup drew to a dramatic last round conclusion. Magnus Carlsen was in the lead, but if Ramesh Babu Praggnanandhaa could defeat him in their mini match, then he would leapfrog over Carlsen and win the tournament. Carlsen just needed to draw their 4-game match 2-all and he would win. So let's see what happened. I should say it was a very nervy final, very nervy indeed. First game, Carlsen had a nice advantage but blew it. Pragg was better but ended in a draw. This is the second game. So Pragg playing white, Carlsen with black. It's a ragazine. Queen a4 check. That's to put the knight on c6 to block the c-pawn, so that white's centre is actually more secure. And this is next move from Carlsen is very trendy. Knight a5, very unusual move, putting the knight at the side of the board. In fact, this was played in the candidates tournament in the game between Ding and Caruana. So it's Carlsen very much on trend with this move. Point is, perhaps you might be able to land a knight on c4, but actually it's really about advancing that c-pawn. I just mentioned a moment ago. The reason for the check was to put the knight in front of the pawn, but it moves, looks like to a very odd square, in order to get c5 in. Now, c5 was the move played in the candidates tournament, but pawn takes pawn here. So Pragg playing in a much more straightforward way. But actually now Carlsen gets in c5. And now the knight comes back. And actually we arrive at a pretty standard isolated queen's pawn position, but quite a good one for black. Quite favourable because there's already a threat to play knight b4, which Carlsen gets in, and this basically means that white is going to have to give up one of these bishops. Now, Pragg has a very strong hold over the d4 square, but there are problems with his position actually. Carlsen already very active here. Okay, I'll give you a moment to think about this. How did Carlsen play here with black? Black to play. Time for a quick slurp of tea. Cheers in my octopus night mug. I really like Carlsen's next move. Pawn to a5. Well done if you spotted that. There are two ideas behind this move. One is that b6 and bishop a6 might come, as in the game. And another idea is if castle's kingside, then rook a6 might come, swinging the rook across the board to the kingside, and that is potentially very dangerous. Pragg played rook c1 and b6 from Carlsen, allowing the bishop to come to a6. And very nice maneuver. You see that bishop has no opponent, having exchanged off white's light square bishop. This is beautiful. In fact, it reminds me of a game between Belyavsky and Geller. If I have time, from one of the Soviet championships, if I have time, I'll try to show you that game, because it's a beautiful Queen's Gambit declined game actually. One of my favourite games of Geller. Rook c8. Castle's kingside. So already this is actually very pleasant for black, with beautiful minor pieces. And now, well, Carlsen kind of trades in one advantage for another. Yes, black's pieces have potential, but now he uses them. Bishop takes knight. Now white would very much like to recapture on d4 with a piece, but queen takes loses material after this, and then bishop takes rook, or bishop takes bishop, then rook takes rook and something drops down here, and obviously knight takes allows bishop takes here. So the upshot of that is that Pragg has to play pawn takes bishop. And that's not so nice when this one is blocked in here. The knight stands superbly on the outpost, and that bishop's still looking good here. So you can see already this is very pleasant for Carlsen. The queen comes to a great square here. F3, Pragg, well, desperate to simplify already, but actually Carlsen is happy to simplify because he manages to create a backward pawn here. And now Carlsen keeps up the pressure, more pressure here. Queen e3 check, rook e8. I mean, to play with black and achieve this position out of the opening is a big achievement. Black is already better here. And Carlsen absolutely in his element. He has a positional advantage. This bishop, you might say, well, it's a bad bishop because it's sort of on the same colour as the pawn, but actually this bishop is on a superb diagonal and it rather restricts that knight. Carlsen's next move, excellent, g6, making sure that knight isn't going anywhere, and also giving the king a flight square. So now this is a threat. So rook c1, and I would expect Carlsen to finish this. This is his kind of dream position. He played rook c4, which is a good move. f5 looks anti-positional, but actually might be even stronger. Watch what happens to that knight. It just gets so badly restricted here. And b5 and b4. I mean, this is such a tremendous position. I mean, this is just an example of what could happen here. White is so tied up, and it's a beautiful illustration of how a rook and bishop combine so well together in some positions. Certainly better than the rook and knight here. And the rook just wants to come all the way down. So f5 looks really strong. Rook c4 also very strong from Carlsen. The rook activating. And here Carlsen played rook a3, also a good move, but there was another strong possibility, and that's to play like this. Wants to get in here. Now here, here, and basically, you know, white is going to win one of these pawns. Well, I mean, black isn't pawn up, but I mean break through with the rook, you know, taking one of these pawns. And this is such a nice position for black. Again, the rook and the bishop combining beautifully, and that pawn on a2 vulnerable. Deep pawn also vulnerable, actually. So that looked like a good option, but Carlsen went for rook a3, also strong. I mean, you could play bishop c4 in this position as well, but he goes for a win of a pawn like this. It's also strong, but well, let's see what happens, because it's a little bit unclear. I mean, there are lots of interesting possibilities here. Carlsen just goes for this straightforward win of a pawn and lands in a rook and pawn endgame. But, you know, of comparing this with other options, the endgame with rook and bishop against rook and knight looked more crunching. This still should be winning, actually. Carlsen was... Well, he played rook d2 check. Could have played rook a4. This is quite subtle. Just bear with me. In this case, he manages to hold on to both pawns, and then the king comes in the middle. It actually looks very nice for black. Should be winning. But Carlsen went for rook d2 check. And here, well, Pragg actually managed to take one of these pawns. You know, there are lots of options in this endgame that Carlsen could have gone for, but it's a little bit surprising he ended up in this position. If you remember, game I showed you between Kyobasa and Vaishali ended up in this kind of position with the rook in front of the pawn. Should be a draw. So that's why Carlsen makes room here. And in fact, there was still a last chance in this position. I mean, this is very, very subtle. He could have played rook c4, which is actually, I mean, I won't go into huge detail, but basically, this one ends up a draw. It's the king can't get over. If king d6, then this happens. And you can see, the rook can't maintain the protection of the pawn. The king would come back. And in this position, should be a draw, basically. White manages to exchange off pawns. And in the game, this was fairly straightforward. Let's just go through. Again, we've got a 3v2 on the king side, and this is well known as a draw. Of course, Carlsen tried. But Pragg defended very well. That's an important move. So it means that if h3, then the rook can check. So basically, Carlsen cannot make progress, and f4 breaks up those pawns. And basically, that is that. And final pawn's taken, and a draw. You know, I would expect Carlsen, with his incredible technique, to finish off that game. There were numerous promising possibilities. I mean, I just pointed out a couple there. But the position with rook and bishop against the rook and knight, that definitely looked easier than the rook and pawn endgame, although there were still chances there, actually. Now, I'm going to show you more from this final round matchup between Praggnanandhaa and Carlsen. That comes in the next video, but this is a very interesting ending. I'm just going to come back to that position, f5. That is a really strong move. So I showed you this variation with king g1, where the knight is very poorly placed, and then b4. Just one more variation, f4. Why not block this pawn and put it on a light square? And, white could dream of putting that knight on e5. Then things might turn around. But watch what happens. The bishop lands on this glorious square, e4. The rook activates. The knight is very poor. It has to come back into the game. Rook a4. So now the rook wants to come in here. Of course, the bishop also prevents the rook coming to the b file. What a square. I mean, this is fantastic. And after this, the rook breaks through. That rook is kind of dominated by the bishop, actually. And after this is a winning position. You can see the rook and the bishop looking at that pawn there. And rook takes a2. Well, they absolutely dominate the position. And that is certainly winning for black. So this wasn't the only opportunity that Carlsen had, but f5 does look very convincing indeed, and I'm very surprised that Carlsen didn't finish this one off. But fair play to Pragg for defending. Anyway, I'm going to show you more from this match in another vid.